Imagine you are walking through the narrow, sun-drenched, labyrinthine streets of Seville in the year of our Lord, 1550. This is the heart of the Spanish Golden Age, the pulsing, gilded artery of a global empire. Seville is the richest city in the world, the bustling gateway to the unfathomable treasures of the New World. The air is thick with a heady, intoxicating mix of scents. The sweet, almost cloying perfume of orange blossoms drifting from hidden Moorish courtyards, the exotic and sharp aroma of cloves and pepper from the teeming docks of the Guadalquivir River, and something else, something acrid, unspoken, and deeply, deeply unsettling. A tension that hangs in the otherwise brilliant Andalusian air like dust motes in a sunbeam, visible only when the light hits it just right. It is the faint, almost imperceptible smell of fear. You pass your neighbor, a respected silk merchant named Diego de Silva, and you exchange a polite, almost mechanically formulaic greeting. Vaya con Dios, you murmur, your voice a little too loud in the narrow street. Go with God. He nods, his own reply equally pious. But your smile doesn't quite reach your eyes, and neither does his. A thought, quick and venomous as a striking snake, flickers through the back of your mind, unbidden and unwelcome. I saw him speaking with a Genoese banker yesterday, a man of questionable reputation, known to have dealings with new Christians. Did he eat pork on Friday? His wife, she is famously meticulous, but does she change the bed linens on a Saturday, as the Judaizers are rumored to do? His grandmother's name was Mendoza, a common converso name. And you know, with a cold, sickening certainty that settles like a stone in your stomach, that Diego is having similar, probing, suspicious thoughts about you. You feel a sudden, desperate need to perform your piety, to cross yourself, to mention your plans to attend Mass. Later that day you hear it, the distant, solemn, heavy tolling of the great bell of the cathedral, La Giralda, a sound that makes the entire, teeming city pause as if it were a single vast organism holding its breath. A procession is moving through the main square, the Plaza de San Francisco. You see them. The condemned, a shuffling, pathetic line of men and women in painted yellow linen smocks, the infamous Sanbenitos, their faces masks of hollow-eyed, abject terror. You see the black-robed officials of the Holy Office, the inquisitors and their armed lay familiars, their expressions as unreadable and impassive as carved stone. You see the whole city, it seems, turned out to watch this grand, terrible, and mandatory theater of judgment. You feel a surge of pious righteousness, a thankfulness to God that you are a good, true Christian, that your blood is clean, that you are a spectator and not a performer in this grim play. But beneath that wave of self-congratulation, there is a cold, deep, powerful undercurrent. Fear. Not just the primal, animal fear of the flames, though that is certainly present, a hot flicker in the back of your mind. It is a deeper, more corrosive, more intimate fear. The fear of a misspoken word in the tavern after too much wine. The fear of a neighbor's envy over a successful business deal. The fear of your own children, who are taught by the parish priest that their first loyalty is to God and the Holy Office, and that they must report any strange customs they see at home. It is the fear of your own thoughts, your own private, fleeting doubts about a point of doctrine, which you now believe might be audible to God and his grim-faced inquisitors on earth. This was the true legacy, the ultimate, dark masterpiece of the Spanish Inquisition. It wasn't just the rack, the pyre, or the damp, lightless dungeons. Those were merely the tools, the crude and brutal hardware of a much more sophisticated and insidious system. The real work of the Inquisition, its most profound and lasting impact, was not written on the charred bodies of its thousands of victims, but on the collective soul of an entire society. It was a meticulously designed machine for manufacturing not just confessions, but a pervasive, all-encompassing, and suffocating atmosphere of religious fear. It created a world where the walls had ears, where your own family could be your accusers, and where the most dangerous and treacherous place on earth was the silent, supposedly private sanctuary of your own mind. Welcome to Torture History. Today, we step out of the claustrophobic confines of the torture chamber and into the sunlit streets, the quiet homes, and the fearful minds of those who lived under the long, dark shadow of the Holy Office. We will explore the dark history of the Inquisition not as a simple linear story of brutal punishments, but as a complex, insidious force that reshaped a nation's culture, its economy, its art, its politics, and its very identity. This is not a story about the handful of heretics who were caught. It's a story about what happens to everyone else, the millions of the Orthodox, when the hunt for heretics becomes a central, organizing project of the state. It's the story of how the institutionalized cruelty of the Spanish Inquisition systematically poisoned the wells of social trust and created a legacy of suspicion, paranoia, and intellectual stagnation that would haunt Spain for centuries. So, find a quiet space, extinguish all distracting lights, and let's examine the subtle, far-reaching, and devastating impact of a society meticulously and consciously built on fear. To understand the profound and unique social impact of the Spanish Inquisition, we must first grasp its specific origins and its primary, obsessive, and almost racial focus, which set it apart from its medieval predecessors. The Inquisition was not an invention of the Spanish. The medieval or episcopal Inquisition was a papal institution created by Pope Gregory IX in the 13th century, to be wielded by local bishops and later by special papal inquisitors from the Dominican and Franciscan orders. Its primary purpose was to combat specific theological heresies that threatened the unity of the Church in places like southern France and northern Italy, most notably Catharism and Waldensianism. But the Spanish Inquisition, established by a papal bull in 1478, was a different beast entirely. From its very inception, it was a tool of the Spanish crown, an arm of the state. The Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, had just united their powerful kingdoms through marriage, forging the nascent state of Spain. Their grand, overarching political project was consolidation and unity. They sought to forge a single, powerful, centralized monarchy from a collection of disparate regions with their own laws and customs. Their powerful motto, the guiding principle of their reign, was Un Rey, Una Ley, Una Fe Un King, one law, one faith. The main obstacle to this monolithic vision was the complex, multi-layered, and deeply intertwined religious tapestry of the Iberian Peninsula. For centuries, Christians, Muslims, and Jews had lived together in a state of uneasy, but often incredibly fruitful coexistence known as convivencia. This was not a modern, tolerant paradise free of prejudice. It was a hierarchical society where Christians were on top. But it was a society where interactions were common and where a stunning degree of cultural and intellectual cross-pollination was a fact of life. Jewish philosophers like Maimonides wrote in Arabic, Muslim scholars like Averroes reintroduced Aristotle to a forgetful Europe, and Christian kings like Alfonso X, the Wise, presided over courts of translators who rendered the great works of Arabic and Hebrew science and philosophy into Latin and Castilian. But by the late 14th and 15th centuries, this delicate, complex balance had shattered. A perfect storm of famine, plague, and fiery religious preaching had unleashed waves of violent, popular persecution. The horrific pogrom of 1391, which began in Seville and spread across Spain, saw tens of thousands of Spanish Jews massacred. Faced with the stark choice between death and baptism, a vast number chose to convert to Christianity. These converts and their descendants, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, were known as conversos, or, in a pejorative and deeply offensive term, marranos, a term meaning swine. The problem, in the eyes of the crown and the fiercely proud old Christian populace, was one of sincerity. Were these conversos true, devout Christians, or were they secretly clinging to their ancestral faith, practicing Judaism behind closed doors, a heresy known as Judaizing? This suspicion was fueled by a toxic, volatile cocktail of genuine religious zealotry and pure, simple, corrosive economic envy. Many converso families, with long traditions of literacy, urban living, commerce, and finance, were highly successful. They were prominent as merchants, physicians, tax collectors, and royal administrators, often occupying the very middle-class roles the old Christian aristocracy disdained. Their prosperity and influence bred deep resentment among an old Christian population that often saw them as arrogant, clannish, and untrustworthy upstarts. The Spanish Inquisition was created primarily to solve this converso problem. Its initial, and for a very long time, its central mission was to hunt down and expose these secret Judaizers, to purify the body of the Church from what was perceived as a dangerous internal fifth column, a hidden enemy within. And the methods it used to achieve this goal would have devastating, long-term consequences for the very fabric of Spanish society. The first and most powerful of these methods, the opening salvo in its campaign of religious fear, was the Edict of Grace. When the inquisitorial tribunal arrived in a new town, its work would begin with a grand ceremony at the local cathedral. The inquisitor, a figure of immense authority, would preach a sermon, and then a formal edict would be read from the pulpit to the assembled populace. This edict outlined, in meticulous and terrifyingly mundane detail, the various practices that could be considered signs of Judaizing heresy. The list was a long and comprehensive guide to paranoia. It included lighting fresh candles on a Friday evening, changing bed linens or putting on clean clothes on a Saturday, not eating pork or shellfish, washing meat to drain the blood before cooking, observing the fast of Yom Kippur, giving a child a Hebrew name, blessing children by laying hands on their head without making the sign of the cross, or even something as simple as turning one's face to the wall when dying. The edict then announced a period of grace, usually 30 to 40 days. During this time, anyone who felt they had committed one of these acts, or any other heretical sin, could come forward, confess their guilt, and receive a relatively light penance. This sounds merciful, but it was a psychological masterstroke of terrifying genius. It immediately planted the idea of guilt throughout the entire populace, especially those of converso heritage, who might have continued innocent family customs without even knowing their origin. People would rack their brains, sifting through their memories, reinterpreting a lifetime of habits through a new, sinister lens. That special stew my grandmother used to make on Fridays, the one without pork, was that a Jewish dish? The lullaby my mother sang to me, did it have Hebrew words? It induced a state of collective anxiety and frantic self-policing. But the truly insidious and socially corrosive part of the Edict of Grace was its second, non-negotiable requirement. You not only had to confess your own sins, but you were also legally and spiritually obligated to denounce anyone else you knew to be a heretic. To fail to denounce someone, to knowingly shield a heretic from the justice of the Holy Office, was in itself a grave sin of obstruction, a crime that could see you arrested, your property confiscated, and your own soul put in peril. This single policy turned every citizen into a potential informant. It weaponized gossip. It monetized envy. It shattered the sacred bonds of trust between neighbors, between business partners, between friends, and even within the supposed sanctum of the family. The Inquisition's voluminous records, preserved in archives today, are filled with harrowing cases of children denouncing their parents, of husbands denouncing their wives, of siblings turning on one another, often over petty squabbles or inheritance disputes, using the tribunal as a weapon. Imagine the agonizing, impossible dilemma. Your neighbor is a converso. You have known his family for years. You see them on a Saturday, the Jewish Sabbath, wearing slightly better clothes than usual. Is this an innocent sign that they are a clean and prosperous family who like to look their best for the Lord's Day? Or is it a definitive sign that they are secretly observing their ancestral traditions? If you denounce them and you are wrong, you have condemned innocent people to a terrifying ordeal. If you fail to denounce them and someone else does, the inquisitors might discover during the investigation that you knew and did nothing. Then you and your entire family could be next. The system brilliantly incentivized accusation. It made suspicion a religious duty and silence a potential crime against God and the state. The legal procedures of the Inquisition were deliberately designed to maximize this atmosphere of religious fear and the prisoner's utter helplessness. When a person was arrested, usually in a silent, terrifying pre-dawn raid by the unarmed but deeply feared lay familiars of the Inquisition, they were taken to the tribunal's secret prisons and held completely incommunicado. They vanished from the world. Their family would not know where they were or what they were charged with. The trial was not a public affair between a prosecutor and a defendant, where evidence was openly presented and challenged. It was a secret, drawn-out inquiry, where the inquisitors were simultaneously the investigators, the prosecutors, and the judges, and the guilt of the accused was, from the outset, largely assumed. The accused had no right to a lawyer in the modern sense. They might be assigned a legal advisor from a list of lawyers approved by the tribunal, but this official's job was often to convince the prisoner of the hopelessness of their situation and to urge them to confess fully as the only path to mercy, rather than to mount a robust defense against the unknown charges. The accused was presented with a list of accusations, but the names of the witnesses who made them were kept strictly secret, to protect them from retaliation. The prisoner was asked to produce a list of anyone they considered to be their mortal enemies. If a witness's name happened to appear on that list, their testimony might be discounted. But this was another psychological trap, a game of blind man's bluff with fatal stakes. How could you possibly know who had denounced you? You would have to guess. Was it the baker you argued with last week? The cousin who envies your wife's dowry? Naming your enemies was a dangerous game. It could backfire, revealing your own conflicts and making you seem like a contentious and uncharitable person. This combination of secrecy, uncertainty, and the official encouragement of denunciation created a world of profound, pervasive paranoia. A business rival, a spurned lover, an envious neighbor, a disgruntled servant, anyone could file a secret denunciation with the Holy Office, and you would never know who had sealed your fate. The very air of the community seemed thick and heavy with suspicion. Let's trace the social death that almost always preceded the physical one, a key feature of the Inquisition's cruelty. The moment a person was arrested by the Holy Office, their property was immediately and meticulously inventoried and sequestered. All their assets, their home, their business, their workshops, their savings, their wife's jewelry, every last coin were seized by the Inquisition to pay for the costs of their imprisonment, including their food and trial. This had a devastating, instantaneous ripple effect. Their family wife, children was instantly impoverished, often thrown out onto the street with only the clothes on their backs, forced to rely on the charity of relatives who were themselves now terrified of being associated with the family of an accused heretic. The prisoner's business would collapse overnight. Anyone who owed the prisoner money was instructed by the tribunal to pay the debt directly to the Inquisition. This economic destruction was a powerful and intentional weapon. It not only punished the accused before they were even tried, but it also created a whole class of people who benefited from the denunciations. The Inquisition was, in many ways, a hugely profitable, self-funding enterprise. The more wealthy conversos it condemned, the more property it confiscated, and the more powerful and feared it became. This created a perverse economic incentive for persecution that ran parallel to its stated religious mission. If the accused was eventually found guilty but reconciled to the church, the fate of the majority, they and their family would still be utterly ruined. They would be forced to wear the humiliating yellow San Benito for a period of time, attending Mass in it every Sunday. But the true, lasting punishment was the infamy that now attached to their name. This was a legal and social stain that was hereditary, passed down through the generations like a genetic disease. The children and grandchildren of a condemned heretic were legally barred from holding public office, from entering the priesthood or a convent, from joining prestigious guilds, from becoming physicians or lawyers, and from attending university. They were a tainted lineage, a permanent underclass, forever marked by the sins of their ancestor. This concept of limpeza de sangre, or purity of blood, grew from the Inquisition's work and became a central, toxic obsession in Spanish society, spreading like a cancer from the mid-16th century onwards. It wasn't enough to be a good Christian. You had to be an old Christian, free from any taint of Jewish or Muslim ancestry. An entire industry, complete with corrupt officials and forgers, grew up around this obsession. People would spend fortunes trying to obtain certificates of pure blood, hiring genealogists to trace their family trees and, if necessary, to discreetly forge them to prove their untainted heritage. This created a rigid, paranoid, and racially stratified society, obsessed with lineage and honor over merit and achievement. The Spanish Inquisition, in its obsessive hunt for religious impurity, had effectively invented a form of institutionalized racial anxiety that would shape Spanish social and political identity for centuries to come. Now, let's consider the broader cultural impact. How did this pervasive climate of religious fear affect the intellectual and artistic life of a nation at the very peak of its global power? Spain in the 16th and early 17th centuries was the center of a global empire on which the sun never set. It was the age of Cervantes' Don Quixote, of the mystical and dramatic paintings of El Greco, of the prolific playwright Lope de Vega, of the courtly genius of Velázquez. But this golden age took place under the ever-watchful, unblinking eye of the Holy Office. The Inquisition maintained a powerful and efficient system of censorship. The Index of Prohibited Books, first published in Spain in 1551 and regularly updated, listed thousands of titles that were deemed dangerous to faith and morals. This included not only the obvious works of Protestant reformers like Luther and Calvin, but also the works of Catholic humanists like Erasmus, whose calls for a more personal and less ritualistic faith were seen as deeply suspect. It included scientific works that seemed to contradict a literal interpretation of Scripture, and even certain works of beloved Spanish Catholic mystics that were deemed too unorthodox in their approach to spirituality. Booksellers were required to keep a meticulous register of their stock and were subject to surprise inspections. The simple possession of a banned book could be grounds for arrest and trial. This pervasive censorship had a profound chilling effect on the intellectual life of the nation. While Spain continued to produce magnificent religious art and literature, its scientific and philosophical output, which had been so vibrant in earlier centuries, began to lag dangerously behind that of other European nations like England, France, and the Netherlands. There was a general retreat into safe, orthodox subjects. Thinkers were profoundly hesitant to explore new ideas or to engage in the kind of open, critical inquiry that might attract the unwanted attention of the inquisitors. The spirit of open debate and intellectual curiosity that was fueling the Renaissance and the scientific revolution elsewhere in Europe was effectively stifled in Spain by the suffocating fear of being denounced for heresy. The dark history of the Inquisition is not just a history of burned bodies, but of burned books, silenced ideas, and stunted intellectual growth for generations. Even religious art, the glory of the age, was not immune. The Inquisition appointed officials, calificadores, to inspect paintings and sculptures, ensuring they conformed to the rigid doctrines of piety and decorum laid down by the Council of Trent in the mid-16th century. Nudity, even in mythological subjects, was deeply suspect. Artists could be called before the tribunal to defend the orthodoxy of their work. The great El Greco himself, with his elongated, spiritualized, and deeply personal style, was reportedly threatened with an investigation for his lack of decorum in some of his religious paintings. The great Spanish sculptor, Juan Martínez Montañez, had to sign a declaration promising that his famous Christ of Clemency statue was made with the appropriate reverence. This led to a certain conservatism in artistic expression, a focus on approved, dogmatic representations of faith. The fear was not just an abstract, societal pressure. It was personal, intimate, and visceral. Consider the life of Saint Teresa of Avila, one of the greatest mystics and religious reformers of the Catholic Church. Because of her intensely personal, ecstatic visions and her emphasis on individual mental prayer rather than rote recitation, she was investigated by the Spanish Inquisition on multiple occasions. Her known converso ancestry also made her a target of constant suspicion. She wrote in her autobiography of living in constant fear, of carefully choosing her words, of submitting all her writings to her confessors for approval, all to avoid being formally denounced. If even a figure of her immense stature and unimpeachable piety, a future doctor of the Church, lived under this perpetual shadow, imagine the terror felt by an ordinary citizen with a converso surname. This constant, low-grade, pervasive fear reshaped the Spanish national character. It fostered a culture of public conformity and private dissimulation. People learned to present a pious, orthodox, and unquestioning exterior, regardless of their true beliefs or doubts. This led to a kind of societal hypocrisy, a deep and unbridgeable gap between public performance and private reality. It also encouraged a certain anti-intellectualism and suspicion of novelty. It was safer not to be too curious, not to ask too many questions, not to read too many books, not to stand out. The ideal subject was pious, obedient, and unquestioning. The national motto became, in effect, "Don't rock the boat." The economic consequences of this social and cultural shift were also profound and long-lasting. The relentless persecution of the conversos, and later the Moriscos, converts from Islam, was a massive brain and capital drain on the Spanish economy. These were often the most dynamic and entrepreneurial members of the urban economy: merchants, bankers, skilled artisans, physicians, and irrigators. As they were imprisoned, impoverished, forced to flee the country, or simply barred from their professions, the Spanish economy suffered a slow, centuries-long hemorrhage of talent and capital. This was compounded by the expulsion of the remaining Jews in 1492 and the final expulsion of the Moriscos in 1609. The Inquisition's ideology of purity had helped to create a state that was, in effect, devouring its own most productive citizens. Furthermore, the culture of limpieza de sangre devalued manual labor and commerce, which were seen as Jewish or Moorish professions, unworthy of a true old Christian gentleman. The ideal of the hidalgo, the nobleman, was to live off the rents of his land and to seek glory in the military or the church, not to engage in the grubby business of trade or innovation. This aristocratic anti-commercial bias, powerfully reinforced by the Inquisition's ideology, is seen by many economic historians as a key structural reason for Spain's slow decline from the economic powerhouse of the 16th century to the sick man of Europe by the 18th. So how did the Inquisition maintain this suffocating grip for over 3.5 centuries? The answer lies in its most powerful public ritual, its ultimate weapon of social and psychological control, the auto de fe, or act of faith. The auto de fe was not just an execution. It was a massive, expensive, and meticulously choreographed piece of public theater, a religious festival of judgment that involved the entire community, from the king himself down to the lowliest beggar. It was a physical manifestation of the Inquisition's power and a terrifyingly effective tool for reinforcing the social and religious order. Imagine the scene. A date would be set, often to coincide with a major religious festival or a royal wedding, and it would be declared a public holiday. The shops would be closed, the fields untilled. The procession would begin at dawn from the prisons of the Holy Office, led by the Green Cross of the Inquisition. Then came the condemned, walking barefoot, holding a lit candle, and wearing their symbolically painted sambenitos and conical hats, or carrozas. The crowd, whipped into a frenzy of pious fervor by days of sermons, would line the streets, jeering and throwing refuse at the heretics, praising the righteousness of the inquisitors. The procession would move with agonizing slowness to the city's main square, where a huge, multi-tiered stage had been erected. Here, in the presence of the highest church and state officials, the sentences would be read aloud, one by one, a monotonous, hours-long drone of condemnation. It was a long, ritualized performance of public shaming and condemnation. For the vast majority of the accused, whose crimes were deemed minor, this was the end of their public ordeal. They were reconciled and would then face their non-lethal penances: flogging, fines, or years of imprisonment in the Inquisition's jails. But for the unrepentant or relapsed heretics, this was just the prelude. They would be formally relaxed, a chillingly passive term for a death sentence, and handed over to the secular authorities for execution by burning at the quemadero, the burning place, which was typically located outside the city walls. The auto de fe was a masterclass in social psychology. For the spectators, it was a complex, intoxicating, and terrifying experience. It was, on one level, a form of grim entertainment in a world that had few diversions. It was a powerful reaffirmation of their own piety and their membership in the community of the faithful. It was a moment of communal catharsis, where the sins of the community were projected onto and then purged through the suffering of a few designated scapegoats. And most importantly, it was a terrifying lesson in power. Seeing a neighbor, perhaps once a respected member of the community, paraded in shame and then led to the flames was the most powerful deterrent imaginable. It taught everyone, in the most visceral way possible, the ultimate price of nonconformity. The memory of a single grand auto-da-fe could police a town's thoughts and behaviors for a generation. The dark history of the Spanish Inquisition is therefore not just a story of torture and executions. It is the story of a society that slowly, systematically, and with bureaucratic precision, turned in on itself. It is the story of how an institution created to enforce unity instead sowed deep and lasting divisions. Between old Christians and new Christians, between neighbor and neighbor, between public piety and private belief. The religious fear it engendered was a slow-acting poison that seeped into every aspect of life, stifling intellectual curiosity, promoting social rigidity, encouraging paranoia, and creating a culture of suspicion that would become a defining feature of Spain's long and difficult journey into the modern era. When the Spanish Inquisition was finally, officially abolished in 1834, it was not because of a popular uprising against it. It was because the world had changed around it. The Enlightenment, the Napoleonic Wars, and the rise of liberalism had made it seem like a monstrous medieval anachronism. But the ghosts it created did not vanish so easily. The deep-seated cultural habits of suspicion, of valuing doctrinal purity over pragmatic progress, of fearing new ideas that challenge the established order, these are specters that have a long and stubborn afterlife, and some historians argue their echoes can still be found in Spanish political and social life today. The ultimate cruelty of the Inquisition was not the fire that burned the body, but the fear that warped the soul of a nation. It demonstrated, on a grand and terrifyingly successful scale, that a state's most effective and enduring instrument of control is not always physical force, but the systematic manipulation of its people's deepest beliefs, anxieties, and fears. It is a timeless and chilling lesson in the profound and often unforeseen social consequences of institutionalized cruelty, a lesson that remains deeply relevant in a world still grappling with the demons of intolerance, xenophobia, and ideological certainty. Thank you for joining us on this exploration of the far-reaching social and cultural impact of the Spanish Inquisition. It's a story that reminds us that the effects of torture and persecution are never confined to the victims themselves, but ripple outwards through generations to shape the destiny of entire nations. If this deep dive into this dark history and the pervasive, insidious nature of religious fear has given you a new perspective on this complex subject, please show your support by liking this video and subscribing to Torture History. Click the notification bell so you won't miss our next journey into the complex and often uncomfortable truths of our shared human past. And now we want to hear your thoughts. What do you think is the most lasting legacy of an institution like the Spanish Inquisition?